Chapter 3 is on our social beliefs and judgments. So, how do we judge our social world? One way is through priming, the awakening of or activating of certain associations. Priming one thought can influence another thought. One thought is linked to another thought because they're closely related. This is an example of automatic thinking, which is impulsive, effortless, and without our awareness. I think that's kind of a long, complicated definition, so let's look at some examples of priming. For example, when I hear the word salt, I might automatically think of pepper. I create an association between salt and pepper. When I'm depressed, I may have negative thoughts. There's an association between feeling depressed and having negative thoughts. One thought of being depressed triggers another. When I think of doctor, I might automatically think of nurse. So it's really creating relationships between two thoughts. One thought influences the other thought. And it's automatic, which means we don't have to think about it. We don't have to consciously think, oh, I thought of salt, so now I'll think of pepper. It just automatically comes without any effort. Intuition, immediately knowing something without reasoning or analysis. That's also an example of automatic thinking. In other words, we don't have to consciously bring it up. It just automatically comes to our mind. Let's look at some examples of that. Emotional reactions are often automatic. In other words, I don't have to think. I think that'll make me mad. I just automatically get mad. It's just something that happens without my conscious effort. Given sufficient expertise, people may intuitively know the answer to a problem. The words to focus on in that sentence are given sufficient expertise. For example, a doctor can look at an x-ray and immediately recognize pneumonia. That's because he or she has sufficient expertise to recognize that. I personally could not look at an x-ray and immediately recognize pneumonia because I don't have that expertise. But if you have expertise in an area, you may be better able to intuitively know an answer. People make snap judgments of others after only a brief encounter. That's also automatic thinking. And I tend to think that's what a stereotype is. When we see someone, we automatically make a judgment about them. I think that's called stereotyping. So we know what intuition is. Can we trust our intuition? The answer seems to be no. So why not? Overconfidence, we often don't realize the errors we make when interpreting certain events and reconstructing their memories. We think we remember things perfectly, and we know that our brains really aren't able to remember things perfectly. We often make a lot of errors. Confirmation bias, we tend to seek out information that confirms our beliefs. Therefore, this information is more likely to become part of our automatic thoughts. We're more likely to pay attention to things that confirm our beliefs. Heuristics are simple, efficient thinking strategies or mental shortcuts. The representative heuristic is to judge something by intuitively, in other words, it's an automatic thought, comparing it to our representation of a category. To me, this is also stereotyping, in which we take a person and we automatically compare them to the category. For example, Bob is wearing a suit and tie and carrying a briefcase. So therefore, we automatically think he's a businessman because he represents what we think of as a businessman. And Bob may not be a businessman. This is just something we automatically think, which again, I feel like is very similar to stereotyping. The availability heuristic. If examples are readily available in our memory, then we presume that other such examples are commonplace. In other words, the more easily we recall something, the more likely it seems. For example, after seeing a movie about a nuclear disaster, you might become convinced that a nuclear war or accident is highly likely. The information is more, quote, available to you. You recently saw this movie about a nuclear disaster. That information is on the top of your brain. It's very available. So that makes you think more about nuclear disaster and therefore may think it's more likely than it really is. Counterfactual thinking. Mentally simulating what might have been, imagining worse alternatives than what might have been, help us feel better. Imagining better alternatives of what might have been help us prepare to do better in the future. We could have won the football game if I had caught that interception. I will practice so I can do better in the future. As opposed to, we lost the game, but it was only by 2 points. We could have lost by much more. Illusory thinking. We expect to find relationships, so we associate random events. This goes back to what we discussed, I think, in Chapter 1, that we want things to be orderly and make sense. And so we take random things and try to associate them because we want there to be order. We are under the illusion that the two events are related. Since we believe this relationship exists, we are more likely to recall experiences that confirm this relationship. Example, if I have a bad experience with a doctor, I may begin to associate doctors with being bad. Therefore, I am more likely to remember my experiences with doctors that confirm this association. I want to confirm this association because I don't want things to be random. I want order. So I'm more likely to remember things that confirm it, so I can say that it's correct. Moods and judgments. Judging our social world doesn't just include our thoughts, which is mainly what we've discussed so far. We also have feelings. Unhappy people, according to the textbook, tend to be more self-focused and brooding. And happy people are more trusting, more loving, more responsive. So again, we see that our thoughts and our feelings and our behavior are all connected. They all affect each other. How do we perceive our social world? Belief perseverance. It is surprisingly difficult to demolish a falsehood after the person conjures up a rationale for it. Our beliefs and expectations powerfully affect how we mentally construct events. Our beliefs and expectations affect how we think. An example, I've decided that smoking doesn't cause cancer. In other words, I've developed this belief that smoking doesn't cause cancer, even though there's much evidence from research that it does. So I've developed this belief. So my thoughts are it doesn't smoke cancer, and that's what I'm going with. So once someone develops a belief, a false belief, it's very hard to get rid of. That they've produced rationale for, it's very hard to get rid of. The misinformation effect. People incorporate misinformation into their memories. It's not that we are totally unaware of how we used to feel, but when memories are hazy, current feelings guide our recall. Memory construction enables us to revise our own histories. We tend to think that our memory is perfect, but we know from research that it's really not. When our brains reconstruct things, we might reconstruct them differently based on how we currently feel or think. So it's important to remember that we often come up with misinformation. Our memories just aren't perfect, and so we may reconstruct things differently from how it really happened. How do we explain our social worlds? How do we explain other people's behavior? Attribution theory explores the answer. Dispositional attribution, the idea that behavior is due to internal factors. In other words, he doesn't do well in school because he lacks motivation. Motivation would be an internal factor. Situational attribution, behavior is due to external factors. He doesn't do well in school because his household is very loud at night and he can't get an adequate amount of sleep. So this is an external factor. Spontaneous trait inference, we automatically infer someone's traits based on their behavior. For example, he just yelled at his sister, so he must be mean. We've seen one example of him yelling, and yet we assume that that means he's a mean person, that he has that trait, and we know that might not be the case. What is the fundamental attribution error? The tendency people have to attribute others' actions to their character, ignoring the impact that situational factors might have on that behavior. So we tend to attribute other people's actions to their character. He doesn't have motivation. That's why he doesn't do well in school. And we ignore the impact that the situational factors might have on that behavior. And if you look at the little diagram, you can see that when they mess up, it means they just suck. But when you mess up, I had a hard day, or I didn't sleep well last night. We tend to blame it on situational factors. Well, why do we do this? When we act ourselves, we're able to pay attention to our environment. If I'm doing a certain behavior, I can look at my environment and see what's going on. But when I watch someone else's behavior, I tend to focus on that person and not so much on their environment, which makes sense because our brains really can't take in every specific thing in their environment. So that's one reason that we make that error. I also think we make that error simply because we like to blame other people's downfalls on their traits. This must be internal, and we tend to not want to take the blame when we make mistakes. We'd rather blame it on something in our environment. So, do our social beliefs matter? Do the things we have just discussed matter? Does it matter how we view other people's behavior and thoughts and how we construct our thoughts? Well, yes, it does. Because the way we believe influences how we feel, how we act, and by so doing may help generate our own reality. So, the way we believe and the way we look at the world is going to affect how we think, act, and behave, and therefore that's our reality. So, it's very important what we believe about others. Thank you, and as always, let me know if you have any questions.